She guessed she was now the senior lab assistant, as there were no other candidates. She theorized with herself as she walked, reckoning that a cure was a little pointless now, but finding out the cause could be useful. She spoke into her digital recorder again. Theory, what if the virus mutates? Could natural immunity be beaten in this way? Are there any other effects of exposure to those immune to the lethality? She stopped recording, running the numbers through her head. Assuming a 90 to 99% non-immunity based on available data, further mutation could be assumed to result in similar lethality with an eventual population effect of 0.1%. She paused, unsure if she should theorize further without a more senior scientist to check her work. She told herself she was the senior scientist, probably in the whole country, so she recorded what she believed. A viral mutation would effectively eradicate the population of the country without a rapid reaction to bring all surviving humans into a controlled breeding program. This would almost certainly require outside organization. If the virus has spread worldwide, which must be assumed based on the transmission being believed airborne, then planetary population by humans is unlikely within a generation. Serious shit. She walked on, looking for alternative transport to walking, even though she had prepared herself by running on the treadmills every day. "You're like a hamster on a wheel," the chief researcher used to say to her. "Maybe we should use you as a test subject." He laughed, thinking it was funny. He was a sexist, racist pervert. If things were normal, she would have written a formal complaint to the university that employed him. As it wasn't, she had to tolerate his endless, sick joke of waving a 5-pound note at her and asking for a happy ending. Still, he was dead now, and she didn't mind one bit. She walked on, planning to find a vehicle and enough supplies to get her on the way to the other site in Scotland. The virology data would advance her theories one way or another. Travel light and keep moving, she told herself. Avoid contact with others in case of viral mutation. The fragility of life. Penny was weak. The pain racked her in waves, taking her breath away. She wanted to tell someone. People said that sharing problems halved them. Did that mean they believed that if she told someone, then her cancer would shrink by half? Stupid thoughts by stupid people. In the end, she had to tell Kate. The paramedic had seen the scars. Being a paramedic, she had learned to guess the surgery from the location and size of the operation scars. "Penny," Kate said softly, "when did you have the colonoscopy?" Penny cried gently as she told the story of how the pain started and how the consultant had wanted to operate quickly. She had tried to refuse, saying that she was too busy at school to take months off to recover. The consultant had told her straight, no operation meant no chance of survival. She had the operation, leaving her deputy head in charge for 9 weeks before she dragged herself back to work. She had put off the follow-up appointments. Then it happened, and there were no longer any doctors left to prescribe her course of chemotherapy. She was dying, and she knew it. She wept into Kate's arms until she fell asleep. Miles away, Kyle also wept pitifully. He did so in silence, so they didn't beat him again for being soft. They brought him out every so often, making him crawl like a dog with a lead around his neck. Soon, they said. Soon he would lead them to his old home where they would take over what the others had built. Then they would give him a new kennel, they laughed. Kyle wished he were dead, but he lacked the courage to invite it from them or do it himself. stepping down. Penny asked to speak to Marie. She came straight away, thinking it was an emergency of conscience. Penny explained what she wanted of her and extracted her promise to keep her word. Penny called again for a council meeting that evening, a week after she had collapsed. She was helped into the room by Kate. She thanked them for coming at short notice and promised to keep the matter brief. I had bowel cancer last year. It was removed by operation, but I believe it has returned, and will soon be the end of me. She looked at the assembled faces, registering shock and fear. Kate had clearly been good for her word on confidentiality. I fear I am of little use to everyone as I am, and it will only worsen for a short time until... She paused, swallowing. Until I'm no longer with you. Tears began to show on her cheeks, mirroring the silent crying from others around the table. It is my wish that my seat on the council be passed on to a worthy candidate, effective immediately. To that end, I propose that Marie be considered for head of house. If any of you have an alternative suggestion, please make it now. She tried to veil the tiredness she felt, but wanted nothing more than to lie down. Nobody suggested another name as she looked at each face in turn. Very well. All those in favor, she said, forcing a smile. All the assembled raised a hand. My other wish is for people to start having babies, she said, throwing out a shocking revelation. Thank you for indulging me, she said with a smile. Now, if you'll excuse me, my doctor insists I rest. Kate helped her from her chair as the council watched her walk slowly from the room. One by one they rose and left without a word, deep in their own thoughts. Unburdened. Dan went to Penny the next day at her request. He thought he should have brought a gift or something, seeing as she was in hospital and terminally ill. He said as much to her, and she dismissed his frivolity. She asked Kate to give them some privacy, which Kate did without a word. I wanted to speak to you for my own peace of mind, she said weakly. She was propped up in bed and looked drawn, pale. What do you want to know? Dan asked, guessing what it was. Tell me about yourself. Who you were before, I mean, she asked. I think you know some of it, Dan said, stalling. I believe you were a military man. Maybe a policeman after that, she said with a smile. Dan smiled back. Right on both counts. I was a Royal Military policeman. Then I joined the regular police after I got out. Why did you leave? She asked. Boredom, said Dan honestly. I wanted a family, and I didn't want my kids born and raised on some drab camp in Germany. I was sick of fighting with pissed-up squaddies, so I left. And then what? Penny urged, her smile wavering with a sudden pain. I started again from the bottom, which wasn't fun, but I got married and had 2 kids. Emily would be 7 now, and Michael would be 4. A single tear dropped suddenly from his cheek, soundlessly hitting the sheets of the bed and soaking away to nothing. Penny gripped his hand reassuringly. They weren't with me when it happened. They were with their mother. None of them made it. I was too upset to bury them. Dan's head dropped, and the tears flowed freely as he let go of the stress. You were separated? Penny asked gently. Divorced. Long story, Dan said with a mirthless laugh, cuffing the tears away from his face. Will you make me a promise? She urged him. What's that? He replied. Speak to Marie, she said with a tremor of passion. She can help you. Dan nodded, not entirely certain he would keep that promise. You had nobody else? She asked. Parents. They didn't speak to them much because of the divorce and the stuff before. I think they blamed me. I had a girlfriend. We hadn't been together too long, but she died too. What happened before? She wanted to know. Oh, that is a long story, Dan answered. Tell me, she asked with a squeeze of his hand. Dan told her everything. He told her of the guilt, the fear and pain of what he went through, which led to the divorce, and all the hurtful revelations that came with it. When he looked up, he saw that Penny had drifted off to sleep with the pain medication and the exhaustion of her illness. Part of him hoped she hadn't hurt him, that she wasn't burdened by his secrets and his pain. He hadn't spoken about it for almost a year, but he did feel better to have shared it. Dan stood, wiped his eyes, and put back on the mask he hid behind every day, and left quietly. Normal service resumed. Penny died in her sleep 10 days later, kept comfortable in medical with liberal pain medication. Dan suspected that Kate had helped speed things along with the morphine. He never mentioned it, but liked to think that she had, and was grateful for it. She was buried during a small ceremony in a patch of woodland overlooking the lake where bluebells grew. Everyone sat through a somber evening meal before Dan broke out a few bottles and poured lots of glasses. He stood on a low table in front of the television and raised his glass. To Penny, he said, holding his glass up as tears rolled down his cheeks. The assembled survivors, a true cooperative society as envisaged by the few he first brought together, echoed his words. The following morning saw the mood no higher, and routine tasks were given out. Dan sent Lexi and Joe out together to gather all the how-to books they could find in a library not far away. Neil made a fuel run with Steve running protection, and a logistics team went with them to clear any more supplies still in date. Mike had continued with the solar power project, having requested the rest of the warehouse contents be brought back. 2 scaffolding towers sat proudly in the space that now saw sunlight, as Jay had cleared almost a dozen trees with the help of some of the newest recruits. Dan had never learned their names, other than Pip, who grew healthier by the day. Pip had loved to read before, she said, and set herself up in the library where she read and sorted the books into order. Mike and Carl were busy providing electricity to the farm, with further plans to do the same for the gardens. That included the cottage on the edge of the now blooming walled utopia. Maggie and Cedric spent a lot of time there, having cleared it out piecemeal. Dan was invited to look at it when he stopped to see their progress one day. It was a lovely place, with a large garden and 3 bedrooms. They had hot water there, courtesy of the solid fuel burner. With electricity, they would have power to the large shower in the wet room. Their formal request to live there permanently came in spring, and was agreed to by the council. Before Dan could raise objections from a safety perspective, Marie asked if they were not overly exposed and without protection. Their firework alarm system was extended, and a CB radio was to be installed in the house, as well as the gardens themselves. Dan also insisted that Cedric keep possession of a Remington shotgun and ammunition. These caveats satisfied, they moved in as soon as their solar panels and additional hot water tank were fitted. They were probably the happiest people there, even happier than Leah, who had become bored with endless training and no live deployments. Even after he had explained that no matter how good she wasn't going out alone until she was older. Dan's thoughts of getting her a short wheelbase Defender were shelved for now, despite him having recovered the right vehicle. He didn't want to risk a teenage strop where instead of going to her room and slamming the door to play loud music, she took a vehicle and automatic weapons. In truth, her accuracy and range drills were second only to a few. She could spar well, Removing knives from would-be attackers was easy for her. She was fit and strong, but still he couldn't allow himself to send a child out to fight on his orders. He loved her like she was his own child, which in a way she was, and his feelings of responsibility made him hold her back. The farms and gardens were producing fresh meat, eggs, and vegetables. Soon there would even be salad. In fact, the only department to be under strength was ops. One of the refugees saved was very ill when he came to them, but when he healed, he formally requested an interview with the OC operations. Dan showed the written application to Steve, who also recognized the military jargon for officer commanding. The man was sent for immediately, and Leah found him helping in the stores. He knocked before entering, despite the door being open, and Dan stood with Steve as he said, "Come in." Dan extended his hand to the man, who was standing rigidly to attention. "At ease, man," said Steve, playing the second in charge perfectly. The man relaxed a fraction, allowing his shoulders to drop an inch. He was tall, but very spare, like he had been starved. Dan put him at about 30, but the worry lines in his face could be betraying a younger man. He hesitated, then went to shake Dan's hand, displaying his own, which was missing the two smallest fingers and part of the hand. Thick burn scars were visible on his right arm and at his neck. Dan sat, inviting the man to do the same. 3 cups of coffee were poured by Leah before she returned to her desk and tapped away at her laptop, pretending not to listen. "What's your story, soldier?" Dan said as he blew in his drink. The man looked at him, realizing he had completely given himself away. "No, sir," he said, offended. "I was a Royal Marine. Corporal." "In that case," said Dan, "accept my apologies, and call me Dan. At the most formal, I accept boss from my lot." "Okay, Dan. I'm Richard. Rich, if you like." The Marine saw Steve looking at his hand. "Helmet, pyrotechnic IED. Got me sent home with 2 boxes that used to be my mates. Last man only survived because us 3 took the brunt of it." Dan nodded, lost for empty words often used to pacify someone's sacrifice for a now utterly pointless loss. He had met a few people injured by improvised explosive devices and knew that the scars ran so much deeper than the visible layer. "After that?" Steve asked. Rich sagged a little. "Medical discharge. 6 weeks counseling on the NHS for the PTSD. Then the booze. Wife left and took the money. Ended up homeless for a time." "And then you were captured?" Steve asked. "Yes, captured and beaten. I hurt one of them badly when they took me. They woke me," he said simply. Waking a soldier by surprise was one thing, but startling a Royal Marine with PTSD was another entirely. "Tell me about your time there," said Dan in an interested tone. "I was sick a lot of the time. No booze. Made me bad for weeks," he offered. "I let myself down. In my day, I could have taken that Bronson character." Dan doubted him slightly on that. "So," Dan said, "how can I help?" The Marine Corporal straightened in his seat, becoming more formal. "Sir, I'd like to offer my service to you," he said. "It's Dan," he said patiently, "and I've got some concerns. I'm off the drink. That's the only good thing to come from that," he said forcefully. "I let myself down and I need to make up for it." There was fire left in the man. Dan saw that and he wanted it, but not at the risk of others. "Maybe so, but there are other issues you will need to address, namely the PTSD. What if I gave you a gun, and the first time you heard a bang, it set you off?" Dan asked rhetorically before continuing. "We have a counselor, and you will see her twice a week until she gives me the clearance to give you active duty." Rich nodded. "You will also undergo physical training until you are fit, and I warn you, she," he said, pointing at Leah, "will outrun and outgun you now. She's 13. Leah smiled as her pretense of being busy cracked. A mile and a half is down to 9 minutes, and her range scores are almost as high as mine. After that, Dan said, you can work from here manning the CB and cleaning weapons. You'll be our quartermaster until we are both independently satisfied of your return to active duty status. So tell me, Marine, are you still interested? Without hesitation, Rich replied, yes, sir. It's Dan. Boss to my lot at best, he repeated patiently. I'm in, boss, Rich said, looking him directly in his eyes. Dan offered his hand again with an accompanying smile. I'll let you know where to be then, Rich. Any excuse. Like an excited boy, Dan went to find Marie. He felt a bit pathetic and exposed when he spoke to her, but this was a perfect excuse for some time alone. He found her room door ajar and knocked. Hello, came the voice from inside. It's Dan. Are you busy? He said, trying to sound casual. No, come in. He walked in to find her sitting on her bed reading a book. She pulled her glasses down her nose and regarded him warmly. They had seen more of each other since she joined the council, and he liked that. How can I help? She asked. You haven't shot someone again, have you? Funny, he said. No, I've just had a rather damaged Royal Marine asked to join, and I need your help. Marie put down her book and patted the bed next to him. He hesitated, and she said, Do I smell? Dan blushed and mumbled that she didn't. Have you brought your wolf? She asked mockingly. Ash seemed to betray him utterly with her, and played the puppy when she called him. No, just me, he said quietly. Well, come in then. He sat with her and explained the meeting he had just had with Rich. He realized halfway through that she must know some of this already and in better detail, but he carried on with his story to cover the fact that he was sitting in bed with a woman he found irresistible but aloof. So, can you work with him twice a week for the PTSD and the alcohol issues? He asked. Yes, but I want you to promise he won't have a gun until I say he's not likely to kill himself with it, she said. Agreed, replied Dan. Good. Now, where were you based? She questioned him lightly, surprising him with a subject change. He rose from the bed, concerned that he was being analyzed. Thanks for your help. I'll send Rich to you soon, he said from the doorway, and he turned to escape. Hey, she snapped lightheartedly. Come here and sit down. With no idea why, he did as he was told. Now, I know you were in the job, so tell me the rest, she said as she closed her book and took off her glasses. He told her some, and she extracted the rest expertly. He didn't tell her everything, though. He wasn't ready for that. What next? A few weeks later, Dan and Marie took a walk around the grounds of the house. It's not so much the PTSD, Marie explained. It's more survivor's guilt, but hugely intensified. We've all got some of both to a degree, he reasoned. True, but what most of us don't have is massive underlying trauma like Rich does. Think about it. He's maimed, he's seen 2 friends die in front of him, his career is over. All of this after years of active service. That's just the beginning. He then goes into self-destruct and spirals into a completely different person. Hence the wife jumping ship as they do, Dan interjected bitterly. Marie raised an eyebrow but let it slide. For now. Yes, he's alone, and the only thing he has to do is replay the bad things over and over. I'm amazed he's still alive, she finished. So the question remains, will he get better? Dan asked. She thought for a few seconds, not about the answer, but about the explanation. Yes. In actual fact, our situation may bring about an almost complete absence of symptoms given the right stimulus, she said. Rich was a unique story to start with, even before it happened. She firmly believed that he was a natural survivor, He'd been shot at, blown up, burned, crippled, abandoned, abused, and beaten. Still, he refused to give in and die. She explained all this to him, and suggested that a gradual increase in responsibility for him alongside careful progress of talking therapy would give him a purpose. With duties, responsibilities, and a reason to get up in the morning and be useful, he will get better quickly. As to the long-term effectiveness of him as a soldier, I simply can't say yet. Dan thought on what she had said.
So you agree that he should follow a daily routine of physical training and rehabilitation, then be given more responsibility in ops without being armed and sent out?
Exactly, she said. I'd like to see him every other day. If all else fails, then repeating "it's not your fault" at him will at least do some good.
Okay then,
said Dan, as he walked along in silence next to her. He liked spending time near her, and selfishly used official reasons to capitalize on it. Ash loped from the trees to his left, effortlessly sliding towards them. He nuzzled his huge head into Marie's crotch, making her squeal and tell him off for being a dirty bastard. Dan smiled, keeping his thoughts private. So, where do we go from here? She asked wistfully, stopping to light another cigarette. He did the same.
We let Chris and the others do what they do. Within a couple of years, we should be almost self-sufficient. Andrew is happy enough with the stores, without the unexpected arrival of another 23 people to feed, that is. All in all, we're doing okay. But we still need to stockpile as much as we can to survive half a dozen winters. I know it seems a bit childish, but I want to stockpile more weapons too. Bullets won't last forever, so we either learn to make them, which is dangerous and difficult, or we have alternatives for the future.
He finished his small speech and stood there in silence. That's cute, she said. But I meant about us, as in you and me, not us as in the whole group. Heart thumping and color rising in his cheeks, he didn't know what to say. She filled the silence for him by kissing him lightly on the lips. One condition, she said seriously, drawing away. That beard's got to go. Main season. Spring was in full flow, and the farms and gardens were full of activity from breakfast until evening. Lambs were born, which meant that Chris and Dana lived in a caravan they had towed up to the farm so that they were on hand to help the ewes give birth. The garden team under Cedric and Maggie had adopted a routine of planting new crops weekly to try and ensure a steady supply of fresh food without wastage. Scouting missions went out, with Dan and Steve taking Leah on a few to keep her boredom levels down. There was very little training left for her to do, and Steve suggested testing her E&E skills soon by seeing if she could make it home while they hunted her. Dan thought that was a good idea, but it needed fine-tuning as he didn't really want her to kill him by accident. The pigs raised a difficult question, and Carrie's biology and genetics knowledge paid off. They marked their herd according to the family tree she had created. To ensure they didn't have inbred livestock, the piglets from last year were separated to keep a couple of boars ready for the breeding program, mixing the different breeds of pigs to create their own hybrid. 3 generations were deemed enough to prevent any unwanted side effects, and the plan was checked over twice. They had enough variety to breed and sustain a herd for the future. Luckily, the bull was young and had plenty of years left in him. The future of the cows was dependent on finding another one at some point. Some joked that he had the best job of everyone there. The egg collections had been stopped, and the chickens had become broody. Soon a multitude of fuzzy yellow chicks were running around making peeping noises. Ewan had reinforced the fences with extra layers of tight mesh, and then requested the help of the rangers. Dan and Steve spent the night awake on the farm using their suppressed carbines with ambient light optics. The following morning, they proudly displayed the ranks of 6 dead foxes for the Welshmen. Ewan was happy, and the carcasses were swiftly skinned and fed to the pigs before anyone more squeamish saw them. Dan's freshly shaved face was noticed but not commented on. He realized how lazy he had become, having spent months just using a set of clippers to trim his whole head every few weeks. He finally moved his room upstairs, after stubbing his toe for the last time on the boxes of ammunition stored in his drafty quarters. He gave up and moved into what was the governor's office. The big desk was moved to a corner, and the filing cabinets went into medical. There was still plenty of spare rooms, as the offices had been cleared out. He moved his double bed in, and soon found that someone else was adding some more feminine touches occasionally. He had given up his old room to be a proper armory, using the cupboard in ops as the store for the farming and hunting weapons. Rich had got himself into a routine, going for a run before breakfast. He had asked for a wetsuit and was taken on a scavenging run. He added a swim of the lake to his fitness regime, which others had taken to copying. Within a few weeks, he seemed much better, both physically and mentally. Dan decided to officially declare him recruited on a restricted basis. He spent his days sorting the armory out, as there were still bags of weaponry taken from various places that had not been sorted. Leah took him to their clothing stores and pointed him towards the black section. Dan had asked him to show Leah all the weaponry and check her skills at cleaning and maintaining them. This served not only to keep her busy with a new skill, but on Dan's request, Rich spoke freely when he could of the horrors he had seen during his service. He still wouldn't talk of the incident that took two people he knew like brothers and left them crippled, but his descriptions of dead Taliban were detailed enough to remove the romantic thoughts in her head about what she was training to be. He watched them from the doorway one morning, sitting at a bench with a rack of guns in front of them. Rich pointed at one, and Leah recited the statistics. Heckler & Koch 416 carbine, police model, which isn't fully automatic. Fires NATO 5.56 from a 30-round mag. Rich moved on to other weapons, receiving similar reports. When she hefted the full-length Remington shotgun with a pistol grip, she looked ridiculous. Rich heard Dan's small laugh and perked up. "Boss, didn't see you there," he said.
"I was just looking at Nikita here, carrying an artillery piece," Dan replied, smiling at the girl.
She had been given the book, but he doubted she had read it yet. In reply, she stuck her tongue out at him. Rich stood, bringing a new weapon from a shelf across the room. "I thought you might be interested in this," he said, handing it to Leah and nodding at her. "Walter P99, 9mm Parabellum, semi-auto, 14-round mag," she parroted.
"In itself, nothing that special," said Rich, with an echo of the professional soldier he once was.
"But it's the only weapon which fits these," he finished, twisting a short suppressor onto the end of the gun. He showed Dan an empty chamber to prove that the weapon was safe and handed it over. It felt a little top-heavy, as he was used to the weight of the short SIG, but the suppressor was a very useful addition. He turned it around, weighed it in his hands, and checked the action. The gun felt good in his hands, solid and chunky.
"Any spare mags?"
he asked. "Thought you might like it," Rich said, smiling, and he produced 2 spares. Dan loaded the weapon, keeping it pointed at the floor. It felt good. He put his SIG on the table and tried the Walther in the holster. It was a universal one and needed a slight adjustment, but the nearly silent weapon fit okay.
"Nice,"
he said. "I'll take it. You might want to take a look at these too then," said Rich, as he gently tipped out a box of attachments and sorted through them before he found the stubby torch attachment to fit the gun. He offered Dan an extended magazine, but with the suppressor on the end and the mag sticking out the bottom, he may as well be carrying the shotgun. Dan also took a holster designed to slip inside a belt which was custom-made to fit the weapon. Something casual for the weekends. Dan left his SIG for cleaning and stowing and took the new toy with him.
"Keep up the good work,"
he said as he left them.
"and grab Neil when you see him to ask about reinforcing these windows now I'm not sleeping down here."
From outside the doorway he said,
"Oh, and Leah."
"Yeah," she answered slowly, fearing that he was setting her up for a joke at her expense. "Driving assessment tomorrow," he said before walking off to find Lou and trade for more needlework. She tweaked the holster perfectly to draw more from under his left arm than across his chest. He preferred that, and it left extra room for 2 more pouches. One to take a small notebook and pencil, and the other the perfect size for a box of 20 and a lighter. The world turned, the sun rose and fell, and progress was made. Burn the L plates. A driving lesson from Dan was not a relaxing experience. He rattled on and on about gear changes and how to assess a bend and what to look out for and what certain things meant. He seemed to forget himself sometimes and told stories of car chases and spectacular crashes, but when she asked him more, he clammed up. She guessed he used to have an exciting job before it happened, but he wouldn't tell her any more about it. He made her talk him through checking the vehicle over first, explaining everything she should look for and the reasons why. Dan always drummed into her that she shouldn't just be able to perform a skill, she should understand why she was doing it. If you only know one way to do something, then you're already out of options, she mimicked back to him during the time he had spent training her. She gave a good rundown of the vehicle. A Defender 90 in a deep metallic red color with chunky tires and a big bull bar on the front. It wasn't modified like some of the others, but she had heavy tow ropes looped on both bumpers. She didn't know it was hers, and Steve had thought he was funny by sticking learner plates in the rear window. She got in and depressed the clutch before starting the engine, going through all the checks she was taught. The first part of her assessment was done on the roads around the house and farm before she drove to the gardens. Dan made her drive into the narrow sections between the greenhouses and polytunnels to practice her maneuvering in cramped areas, and she performed well. He took her out onto faster roads and made her push the speed up. Her reactions and observations were good, but Dan still offered pointers for improvement. He forced himself to be quiet and objective. She saw obstructions and assessed them well, especially when Dan made her drag a car out of the way as though it was blocking the road. She connected the tow rope securely and reversed her Land Rover away under control. He took her over rough terrain and watched her technique critically. He couldn't really fault her, but then she was just replicating what he had shown her. She drove him back to the house after over an hour, and Dan gave her the final test. Okay, imagine you've got a flat tire. Change the wheel, he said, pointing at the passenger side at the front. Leah hesitated. She got the tire wrench from inside the back door and tried to loosen the nuts on the spare wheel mounted high on the back door. She struggled, eventually removing them, but she couldn't lift the wheel down without risking damage to the wheel or herself. It finally dawned on her that she wasn't physically capable of doing it, and she sagged with failure. Dan rested a hand on her shoulder kindly. Don't worry about it for now. We'll have to figure something out, he said. Leah wiped a tear away from her cheek and nodded. She went inside, and Dan put the spare wheel back on, feeling bad for disappointing her. If she couldn't do the most basic repair, then it wasn't safe for her to go out alone yet. The Leah Show. Dan felt bad for her. She had learned so much and trained so hard, only to be denied her independence because she was too small to change a wheel. He couldn't, in good conscience, let her go out alone. What he could do was take her on a run and be her backup. A food run was planned. They had to go much further afield now, as they picked clean the supermarkets within a short radius of home. With the distance being longer, the danger increased. Other than that, it would be business as usual. 2 scavenging trucks and a ranger escort. The target was on the outskirts of the city to their north, about as close to the fetid population center as he dared go. Jimmy and Mark were in one lorry, with Laura and one of the Bronson survivors in another. Dan's feelings of shallowness returned briefly as he again realized he didn't know half the people who relied on him and his team for protection. He told Leah that she was on the protection team for the operation, making her day, but trying to sound casual about it so as not to be seen to be throwing her a sympathy party. He justified the additional firepower by making a point about the proximity to the city. She loaded up her G-36 and took 3 spare magazines. She tried to be casual about it, too, hiding her excitement at a live deployment well, right up until Dan threw her the keys to his Discovery. She drove well, leading the convoy north with the huge head of a slobbering dog over her left shoulder. Dan had to tell her to keep her speed down to take the pressure off the following heavy trucks. It took them almost an hour to reach the target, and on instruction she drove slowly into the car park. No recent signs of activity were evident, so Dan called in the others to wait as they cleared the shop. They forced open the sliding doors and stalked in, crouching low. Even Ash mimicked the search pose, dropping his body weight like a panther as he sniffed the ground. He was restless. He didn't like something he smelled. His low growl was interspersed with a throaty whine, which Dan hadn't heard before. "What's the matter with you?" he asked the uneasy dog as they checked each aisle and found the shop devoid of life. Ash continued to whine and even let out an uncharacteristic bark. Dan wasn't impressed, as he'd worked for hours on keeping Ash silent when on the job. His instincts were to trust the animal, but his eyes told him there was nothing there. Literally no sign of human life at all. He ignored both the dog's and his own instincts and put Ash back in the Discovery after they had cleared the shop floor. They returned to do another sweep and found the fire exit wide open after they passed through the plastic curtains leading to the stockroom. Dan and Leah came back outside and called the others in to clear what was left. Only about a quarter of the contents were of use anymore, the rest having spoiled way beyond salvage. The 4 scavengers moved fast. Most bizarrely, Jimmy used a handful of pound coins to release trolleys for them to use. Why he didn't just cut them away with bolt croppers amused Dan greatly. Jimmy liked those small intricacies of life. Ash barked again from the inside of the 4x4, and the muted sound made Dan turn. "What's wrong with that bloody dog today?" he asked Leah. She shrugged and turned back to the shop. Ash whined and scratched at the windows, unseen by the absent Dan. Movement in the car park made Dan turn and watch in sudden alert silence before his frantic barking sounded again. Dan came back out into the car park, striding angrily towards the car and the ill-behaved animal. A scream rang out from inside the shop, a scream of pain and fear, somehow guttural and primeval. Ignoring his ballistic companion, Dan turned on his heel and sprinted for the entrance. Gone to the dogs. Leah was unsettled by Ash's behavior. She had never seen him act like that, but Dan had locked him away, so obviously it wasn't an issue. She trusted Dan's instincts. He should have trusted them too. She walked along the aisles, looking for anything of interest as the others worked hard stacking tin cans into the bags for life in the trolleys. She reached the section where the bakery had been, expecting to find the bread and cakes rotted away as in the other shops she had seen, only they weren't. They weren't there at all. The packaging had all been ripped open, leaving a mess of torn wrappers on the floor. She froze, trying to figure out what she was seeing. She couldn't make sense of it. Why would people have ripped it all up like that when they could have just opened it? The scream cut through her pondering. It cut through the very air like a serrated blade. She hoisted her weapon and sprinted the 3 aisles to where the noise had come from. She was met with 3 of the team all looking terrified. Jimmy was the only one to be switched on. "Mark!" he said aloud, counting the only one of them not there. He automatically discounted it being Dan, unless he was the one to have elicited the scream from someone else. Another scream, slightly further away, and this time it continued in panic and pain. Leah ran towards the sound. She later realized that deep down, she was that kind of person. People always said, "Oh, if that happens, I'd do this." They reeled off their actions to any given scenario, not realizing that they would probably do the complete opposite. Very few people have the natural instinct to run towards danger when every fiber of your body wanted you to flee and protect yourself. She reached the end of the aisle and turned. What she saw would stay with her forever. Mark was bleeding heavily and jerking like a float on a fishing line. The jerking and the bleeding were caused by the 4 or 5, she couldn't be sure because they moved too much, dogs that were ripping him apart. They were 10 meters away, and she let out an involuntary cry of shock. 2 of them looked up at her. They were filthy, mangy, cruel-looking creatures. The one nearest her was a thin Staffordshire Bull Terrier, and it still wore a ragged collar once put around its neck by a loving owner. The yellow eyes fixed on her as it let out a savage snarl. Along with another rangy-looking mongrel, it launched itself at her, feet scrabbling desperately for purchase on the shiny floor. Leah reacted. Most people would freeze or scream in terror. Most people would get killed by the pack of wild dogs. Most people weren't carrying weapons, however. She dropped to put her right knee on the floor as she raised the weapon and flicked off the safety all in one fluid movement. Bang, 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 bang. The force of the launch had given the squat terrier a terrible momentum, which served no purpose other than to propel its dead body across the ground, where it slid to a bloody stop against her left boot. The mongrel had been stopped in its tracks meters away by her second double tap, but the other 3 paused in their attack of the now silent Mark and stared at her. Dogs weren't supposed to do that, she thought, losing valuable seconds of reaction time. They were supposed to be scared of loud noises. These dogs weren't. They had banded together, more natural a reaction than the cohesion of their own group of survivors. The reason this area was devoid of signs of looting was because of this vicious pack of killers. They tolerated no intrusion into their territory, and they also wasted no meat. The 2 dead dogs represented a significant change in opposition number to Leah, she reasoned, as she lined up to kill the other 3. What she didn't know was that the 5 she saw were only the advance party. She heard growling and the noise of claws on the floor, making a swarm of clacking noises as more of the pack attacked from behind her. She flew to her feet. "Climb!" she screamed at the 3 dumbstruck scavengers. They scrambled up onto the shelves, a last trailing limb only just getting out of reach of the snapping jaws. "Dan! Dan!" Leah bawled, not out of panic, but to warn him to get off the ground. They were trapped on wobbling shelves, a horde of ferocious teeth hungrily flowing behind them and making attempts to jump to reach the intruders. Leah tried to turn and kneel up, but the shelf wobbled too much. Afraid of falling into the mass of murderous teeth below, she carefully shifted her weight in an attempt to bring the weapon to bear on the wild animals, all the while bawling Dan's name. Cry havoc. Dan ran in, hearing the 2 controlled double reports from Leah's gun. How could I have missed something? He thought angrily to himself, cursing his mistakes for putting the others in danger. He heard strange noises as he ran through the shop. The snarling, snapping, and barking from a multitude of canine mouths was unmistakable. Leah's voice calling his name cut over the cacophony. "I'm here!" he yelled back. "Climb!" she screamed. "Get off the fucking ground!" Bizarrely, he wanted to admonish her for the language. That such a thought could force its way to the front of his mind was ludicrous, given the situation. He leapt onto a low chiller unit and used his hands to pull himself to the top where he could stand. The scene below him was hideous. He guessed about 30 dogs swarmed en masse around the next aisles, desperate to reach their quarry. He could see Leah wobbling on top of a stack of tins, pushing them to the floor in an effort to stand up without falling. The others were similarly perched in a precarious way, trying to stay flat and not fall to a terrible death. He flicked the safety catch to automatic and stitched the mass of dogs with 4 long bursts, killing maybe 10 and emptying the magazine. He reloaded and looked for more targets, but was blocked by the shelves between him and his friends. He moved to the end of the refrigerator he was on, twice slipping in the dust of grime out of sight from ground level. As he reached the end, he saw Mark, not that he could tell it was him from the blood, crawling away with difficulty. 3 dogs peeled away from the pack and made their way towards the prone Mark, excited by the movement. Dan fired into them, not wasting time by picking individual targets, but just firing until they stopped. He was trapped. He couldn't reach the others without getting down, but to do so would invite more targets than he could fell. Desperately, he looked over to see Leah finally gaining purchase and pushing up onto her knees. Leah's heart was pounding, her blood around her body with more force than she had ever known. Her hands shook from the adrenaline, making her movements ungainly and clumsy as she manipulated her weapon to bring it to bear on the besieging pack. She fired bullet after bullet into the pack, just as Dan had, without picking targets. She fired the remainder of the magazine and almost fell as she twisted to free a replacement from her vest. She righted herself, breathing as steadily as she could before resuming her methodical execution of the animals. She fired, aimed at another dog, fired again, and switched her aim to see a dog flinch and snarl in pain as it was struck by a tin can. She flicked her gaze sideways, following the reverse trajectory of the missile to see Jimmy hurling cans at the monstrous dogs before resuming her executions. After she had killed almost half of them, a single loud bark sounded. As one, the pack turned and fled through the plastic curtains and out of sight. Dan had emptied his magazine on full auto into the fleeing dogs, taking down another 8 or 10 as they ran.
"Are you okay?"
he shouted blindly to her in desperation. She looked at the other 3 with her, 2 still frozen in fear on top of the shelving. "Fine here," she shouted back, her voice cracked with terror. "Mark's down," she said.
"He's alive,"
Dan yelled back, unsure how long his condition would remain that way. A few stragglers still roamed the shop, growling as they paced angrily, having been denied their kills. Before the thought could make its way to Dan's mouth, Leah shouted to him, "We need to move before they come back." He couldn't agree more.
"On me,"
he yelled as he jumped down and dropped to his knee to cover the door where the pack had gone. Tins cascaded to the floor as Leah marshaled the others down. Jimmy came first, now holding Leah's sidearm and scanning with wild eyes. Leah held the rear, scanning for the marauding animals and walking backwards in a semi-crouch as they approached the bleeding mess of their friend.
"Get him up. Move,"
Dan said, the panic making his tone more threatening than he intended. They dragged Mark to his feet. He groaned in pain, but didn't seem to be bleeding out. It was pure luck that they hadn't ripped open an artery. They moved towards the entrance in a bubble, Leah looking forwards and Dan looking back towards the stockroom. Movement flashed all around them as the wild dogs slipped between the aisles to stalk their progress. The dogs had lost most of their pack and were wary. Wary, but hungry. "Hold," said Leah as they reached the threshold to the outside world. She took careful aim and fired a series of calculated shots at the few animals who had made it out the back to cut off their retreat. More movement showed at the rear of the shop as the dogs poured back into the aisles.
"We need to move,"
Dan called to her without taking his eyes off the targets. He was forced to aim along the barrel as the distance was too short to use the optic. He fired at shapes, only hitting one as they stalled in the entrance. "As one, keep together," Leah answered as they crept painfully slowly towards the safety of their vehicles. To break formation and run would be to invite the animals who hunted them to attack again. Sticking together was the safest way to move, but it was also the most frightening. They reached the rear of the first truck, and Jimmy hoisted the roller door for the other 2 to load the bloodied Mark inside. They climbed through the window into the cab and were told to start the engine and wait. The remaining 3 made their crab-like way to the other lorry where Jimmy climbed in first. Dan and Leah followed, giving instructions to drive them close up to the Discovery to save a panicked dash across the tarmac. Ash was beside himself with impotent fury. His spittle had soaked the inside of the window and steamed up the van as he had barked with intensity watching the scene unfold. Dan couldn't risk him getting out. As good as Ash was, even the remaining dogs of this pack would tear him apart. Dan forced his way in, keeping a tight hold on his livid dog. Leah climbed behind the wheel and took off at speed, the 2 lorries following suit. The pack chased them for a few hundred meters until outpaced by the machines. After a mile of Leah setting a fast pace and checking the mirrors, she stopped abruptly. She grabbed her bag and piled out, telling Dan to drive. She climbed into the back of the first truck and pulled down the shutter as the convoy got underway again. It took 3/4 of an hour to get back, during which Leah worked on cleaning and dressing Mark's wounds in an attempt to stop the bleeding. Not a single limb had been left without deep puncture wounds, the worst being on his hands and his upper left arm. She staunched the flow of blood as best she could, talking to him the whole time to try and keep him conscious. She held his legs high in spite of being constantly buffeted by the moving van. By the time they got back, he had faded. The gray pallor and clammy feel of his skin denoted his descent into shock. Unbeknown to her, Dan had the sense to put the medical team on alert via radio. His message of a dog attack didn't even begin to convey the severity of the near miss they had just experienced. Laura drove straight to the entrance and stalked hard, sliding both Leah and Mark along the bed of the lorry. The shutter burst open to reveal Kate with a stretcher. Hands grabbed at Mark and pulled him out where he was wheeled away for treatment. Leah sat back on her feet and stayed kneeling for a minute as she caught her breath. Blood-soaked dressings littered the truck, and as she followed the blood trail in reverse from the door, she saw her hands and arms were red with sticky blood as it congealed on her skin. Disgusted, she got to her feet and felt the pins and needles tingle her legs in pain. She jumped down, almost losing her footing as she landed and fell into Dan. She was exhausted from the adrenaline, as well as from the stress and the physical effort. Not in the mood for talking, she pushed him away without making eye contact. "Next time, listen to Ash," she said as she walked towards the house, rubbing away her tears of anger. It's always when the dog dies. Mark survived. He was in medical for a fortnight and needed fluids and a significant donation of blood. The injuries weren't too severe on the whole, but the infections rampaged through his body, leaving him skeletal and weak. His eyes were sunken and his skin took on an unhealthy tinge, but he lived, albeit horribly scarred. Sarah's knowledge was as important as Kate's when it came to his treatment. Knowledge of the diseases that feral dogs could carry probably saved his life, as she suggested the best ways to counteract the illnesses he suffered. He didn't blame anyone, despite Dan blaming himself, as was his manner. Mark never even knew the dogs were there until he was pulled to the ground. Most of what followed seemed like a bad dream to him now. Leah's mood evaporated quickly.